Welcome to this hearing of the Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. Thank you to my colleagues. Apologies for my keeping you waiting. Our focus this afternoon is the threat that Chinese hacking and interference poses to our democracy, to our national security, to our economy, including tech's ties and its vulnerability to the Chinese government. According to the FBI and DHS, ahead of this month's election, a Chinese hacking group dubbed Salt Typhoon broke into several American phone companies to spy on political and government targets. The Wall Street Journal has reported that those targets included the Vice President-elect, our colleague Senator Vance, Senate staff, members of the Harris campaign, and possibly others. And I want to enter into the record that article from the Wall Street Journal reporting on that spying and hacking. Those reports, without objection, those reports also revealed that Chinese hackers had targeted the wiretapping capabilities used by law enforcement, and that hackers were able to compromise private communications and call records. Now, think of it for a moment. A foreign adversary attempted to wiretap both presidential campaigns during this past election. We're still learning each week about how sprawling and catastrophic this hacking campaign was. But what we know now, and it's publicly known, should galvanize action now. We need to ensure that these specific types of hacks will never happen again. The Federal Communications Commission has the legal authority, right now it has the power to set and enforce security standards, and I urge the FCC to start a rulemaking process and investigation. It can be started under this administration, carried forward under the next. There should be bipartisan unity on the urgency of that action. This isn't the first time we have faced an urgent crisis created by Chinese hacking and malign influence. Again and again, America is caught flat-footed by Chinese spying. The breaches of the Office of Personnel Management, Equifax, the countless defense contractors breached, espionage risks from Huawei, DJI, and TikTok. The list goes on. We need to radically rethink how we are protecting against Beijing's spying and influence. This year, Congress took an important initial step to address these risks. Congress imposed limits on Chinese state-affiliated apps operating in the US. That includes TikTok, but it could also apply to Chinese social media apps that take TikTok's place, like WeChat. I want to be clear, the law requires the divestment of TikTok's American operations next year. The president can extend the deadline once, but he can't ignore the law. If he wants to change the law, he can try. But I can tell him and tell the American people, sentiment's pretty strong here in favor of that law. Even as Chinese companies undermine our national security, Americans ones often do the same. China has used economic coercion to enlist American companies for its own agenda, and we have given them a free pass far too often. Companies like Apple have acted as partners of the Chinese government to censor ideas and information in China. They've blocked independent media, and they've helped the CCP crack down on dissent. Human rights and democratic values, but also our national and economic security, are at stake as a result of China's leverage, its economic leverage, and these conflicts of interest involving American companies. Relevant to this hearing, Tesla makes half of its cars and as much as a third of its sales in China. Elon Musk is so concerned about protecting Tesla's market access that he pledged to uphold, quote, core socialist values, end quote, in China. He's been parroting Chinese talking points on Taiwan. According to the Wall Street Journal, senior Chinese officials are even looking to use Mr. Musk to influence the White House. And I'd like to enter into the record without objection that Wall Street Journal report. Meanwhile, the Department of Defense and other agencies are becoming more reliant on Mr. Musk's SpaceX, and now he's been promised power over the entire federal government. Those extensive economic ties and China's willingness to exploit them are a dangerous combination, a real risk to this country. It's a broad issue. Mr. Musk and Tesla are far from the only ones in big tech facing this situation. Apple complies with China's censorship and surveillance demands because 20% of its sales and 80% of its suppliers are based in China. When forced to choose between American security and hugely profitable access to the Chinese markets, Americans may doubt that SpaceX, Mr. Musk, Tim Cook, and other technology leaders will side with America. This subcommittee has focused on artificial intelligence for the past 2 years. Opponents of regulations often cite a race to AI with China as an excuse to avoid regulation and do nothing. But according to Reuters, Chinese researchers are using Meta AI model for military purposes. Big tech companies have also provided computing power and collaborated with Chinese AI companies. And I'm going to put that Reuters report in the record without objection. So if this is a race, why are we giving our opponents a huge head start? That's why Senator Hawley and my bipartisan framework on AI includes export controls and limits on providing AI models and computing power to Chinese companies. Those export controls are a fundamental part of our framework. I hope we can turn this framework into real rules to provide American AI technologies from being used against us, as well as deal with the broad set of threats we discussed today. Thank you all for being here, and I'll turn to the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. Thanks to our witnesses for being here. I'll just add briefly that the scope of the Salt Typhoon hack, as we understand it now, is truly breathtaking, truly breathtaking. You think about who this group, with the backing, as we understand it, of the Chinese government targeted. The staff members of the current Senate Majority Leader, the staff of the current Vice President of the United States, the current President-elect of the United States, the Vice President-elect of the United States. And to the extent we know, they were successful, perhaps, in garnering at least some of the communications of these individuals and their staffs. So this is truly extraordinary. And I hope it is a wake-up call for our entire government, our entire country, that we face with China a peer competitor of a kind that we frankly haven't seen in any of our lifetimes. And I hope it's also a wake-up call for these American corporations that for too long have been willing to sell out American jobs and America's security interests in order to make a quick buck, and in so doing have threatened all of us. If there's ever an advertisement for bringing our critical supply chains home, if there's ever an advertisement for bringing back core American manufacturing, if there's ever an advertisement for safeguarding American jobs in every sector, particularly these critical sectors that have to do with telecom and communications, this is it. This is it. The time is upon us now to make sure that we safeguard these critical industries and that we put an end to Chinese influence and espionage, which is trying to spread itself into every sector worldwide and right here in the United States. That's why this hearing is so timely. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. I'll introduce the witnesses, then swear them in, and then we'll turn to you for remarks. Isaac Stonefish is the CEO and founder of Strategy Risks, a leading data and research firm that helps businesses and policymakers navigate and mitigate complex risks with a particular focus on China. Isaac has spent 7 years living in China and has more than a decade of expertise in analyzing the country's political, economic, and strategic dynamics. Sam Bresnick is a research fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology. His research focuses on the national security applications of artificial intelligence and Chinese technology issues. David Stehlin, former Marine Corps officer and current Chief Executive Officer of the Telecommunications Industry Association, a standards developing organization and representative of trusted manufacturers of ICT equipment. Adam Meyers is Senior Vice President for Counter-Adversary Operations at CrowdStrike, where he leads threat intelligence operations. Meyers directs a geographically dispersed team of cyber threat experts tracking criminals, state-sponsored and nationalist cyber adversary groups across the globe and producing actionable intelligence to protect customers. We thank you all. If you would please rise, I'll administer the oath. You swear that the testimony you're going to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Thank you. Mr. Fish, we'll begin with you.
Thank you. Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Hawley, why does it matter that Microsoft partners with the Communist Party of China? What impact does Apple's supply chain exposure to China have on US national security? And why is Tesla's Elon Musk a free speech advocate, except when it comes to China? My name is Isaac Stonefish, the founder and CEO of Strategy Risks, and I want to talk about the ways in which big US corporations in the tech space help endanger US national security, how we should think about it, and what we should do about it. In the weeks following the revelations of the massive Chinese Salt Typhoon hack against US targets, and in the weeks following a presidential election that could transform US policy to China, this subcommittee is wisely asked about the implications of major US tech companies' exposure to China. For decades, US tech companies have integrated their supply chains into China, partnered with party institutions, and built multi-billion-dollar sales and distribution channels into the Chinese market. In the 2000s and early 2010s, before Chairman Xi Jinping's dominance and repression, before the genocide in Xinjiang, before the trade wars, before Beijing's horrifically irresponsible behavior during COVID, and before China began seriously threatening US hegemony, US tech companies could partner with the party and not necessarily jeopardize US national security. Those days are over. Companies with high China exposure often downplay the risks of Beijing's actions to US interests, move US jobs overseas, partner with businesses committing human rights abuses in China, and even strengthen the Communist Party so that it can implement actions like this successful attack against the US government. So, what does exposure to China mean? How do you define it? Strategy Risks defines and measures exposure through 5 categories: business fundamentals, partnerships and politics, regional issues, supply chain, and opacity. Business fundamentals measures revenue in China and other key business measures, reflecting economic and financial China risks. Partnerships and politics, and this is probably the most important one, measures a firm's relationship with both state-owned enterprises and the Communist Party directly. Regional issues measures risks related to issues such as forced labor, human rights concerns, and regulatory challenges like what's going on in Xinjiang, where the party is actively committing a genocide against the local Uyghur population. Supply chain measures a firm's risk from sourcing materials from China. It's one of the most difficult spaces to get information, and we urge pushing for more transparency about US company supply chains into China. And then opacity reflects a firm's relative lack of disclosure of information related to China-related risks, so that firms that are very open with their stakeholders about their China exposure don't get penalized as much as firms that try to hide what they're doing in China. These scores are reflected in the Strategy Risks SR250 index, which tracks the China exposure of 250 of the largest publicly traded firms in the United States. There are a mix of factors that drive these scores. However, one common theme is that large firms which conduct business in China need to partner with and satisfy the party and the Chinese government to ensure business access in China. The Chinese market operates at the behest of the government, and laws in China follow the dictates of the party. One-party rule and one-man rule means that laws are negotiable, which forces firms operating in China to align with the political party in power instead of a neutral state apparatus. In my written testimony, I delve into the details of Apple, Tesla, Microsoft, and other US tech companies that have very high exposure to China. What I'll say here is that our assessments demonstrate that there are serious structural risks in these firms' exposure to China. These firms willingly partner with Chinese entities and personnel that have ties to state security organs. They work with firms that very poorly vet their supply chains, have significant exposure to human rights abuses, and are deeply entangled with the People's Liberation Army, which is the military in China and the armed wing of the Communist Party. US tech companies have long tried to balance between the United States and China, but both the US government and the Chinese government want them to make a choice. Choose China or choose the United States. US tech companies have long put off that decision, but now's the time to decide, and time is running out. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Stonefish. Mr. Bresnick?
I'm getting a red light here. Is that, okay, cool. Chair Blumenthal, Ranking Member Hawley, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My testimony focuses on a critical national security concern: the deep economic and technological interdependencies between US technology companies and China. As the world faces an increasingly complex geopolitical landscape, we must better understand the national security risks these ties present, as well as how they may impact corporate decision-making during future crises. I will discuss some lessons from US tech companies' involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war, and I will explain how they might apply to a potential conflict with China over Taiwan. To respond to these challenges, I recommend that the US government identify the optimal US-China de-risking balance, enhance transparency into US tech firms' operations in China, and encourage these companies to develop contingency plans for high-stakes scenarios. Tech companies' activities in China affect not only their bottom lines, but also broader US national security objectives. At the outset of the Russia-Ukraine war, several US tech companies provided the Ukrainian government and military with cutting-edge capabilities across cyber defense, ISR, and even targeting. Few, if any, of these firms relied on Russia for revenue, manufacturing, or research and development, which allowed them greater flexibility to align their actions with US and allied interests. But US tech companies' flexibility in decision-making, without the risk of significant financial or technological losses or disruptions, may not apply as readily in future crises involving China, where economic and technological entanglements run far deeper. Many of the US companies that played pivotal roles in Ukraine have substantial footprints in China, creating a complex web of mutual dependencies that could influence their responses to a conflict. China's history of leveraging economic coercion to advance its geopolitical objectives and respond to perceived threats to its territorial integrity, national security, or the Communist Party's legitimacy further complicates this picture. One of the primary areas of concern is the significant portion of revenue that some US tech companies derive from the Chinese market. For some corporations, China accounts for approximately 20% of global revenue, and losing access to this market would represent a substantial financial blow. In comparison to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, where the financial cost of withdrawing from the Russian market was relatively low, the high stakes involved in losing the Chinese market could deter companies from taking actions perceived as antagonistic to China. Supply chain entanglement with China is another critical area where US tech companies face substantial challenges. Companies with a high degree of reliance on Chinese factories and supplier networks face particular risks, as production delays or supply chain shutdowns could create significant barriers to maintaining operations. US tech companies could find themselves in a position where they must weigh the risks of disrupted supply chains against support for US or allied strategic objectives. This dependency underscores the importance of creating a resilient supply chain that mitigates risk by diversifying beyond China. But the entanglements extend beyond revenue and supply chains to R&D investments, which are important factors in US tech companies' innovation ecosystems. China is a significant base for R&D activities for many leading US firms, particularly in fields such as artificial intelligence and hardware design. A reduction in R&D output due to regulatory or operational constraints imposed by China could ultimately weaken U.S. competitiveness in critical technology sectors. Given these complexities, the U.S. government has a critical role to play in mitigating the vulnerabilities of U.S. corporations operating in China and ensuring that they can respond effectively to potential future conflicts. I have some policy recommendations for Congress as a whole to act on. First, Congress should create incentives to support supply chain diversification, reducing corporate reliance on China-based manufacturing and suppliers. Programs that facilitate partnerships with alternative suppliers or business associations in third-party nations, or that encourage reshoring of critical production activities, could help build a more resilient manufacturing base that is less vulnerable to coercive pressures from geopolitical rivals. That said, I believe a full decoupling would be unwise, as mutual interdependence could stabilize bilateral ties and act as a brake on future conflict. Second, U.S. companies should be required to disclose detailed information on their foreign dependencies, including revenue shares, supply chain sources, and R&D investments and activities, particularly in nations that may pose a strategic risk. Third, to prepare for potential crises, companies with significant dependencies in China should be encouraged to develop contingency plans that address scenarios like a Taiwan crisis. These plans could outline alternative supply chains, potential relocation strategies for research and development, and fallback options for capital assets, ensuring as much as possible that corporate interests remain aligned with U.S. national security objectives. In summary, my testimony highlights the deep entanglements of U.S. technology companies with China and the challenges these ties could pose in a conflict scenario. While these companies demonstrated a strong capacity to support U.S. and allied interests in Ukraine, their financial, operational, and strategic dependencies on China present a far more complex and potentially constraining scenario. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Bresnick. Mr. Stehlin.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to this subcommittee on this extremely important subject, securing the information communications technology, ICT supply chain, so that Americans can depend on trusted, secure, resilient, and high-speed networks. I've been the CEO of TIA for the past 5 years, and have run both publicly traded and venture-backed technology companies over my 40 years in the industry. I've seen tremendous change and technology improvements, and have learned that security improvements always follow technology advancements. I've experienced firsthand how state-owned entities like Huawei operate on the global stage, undermining a competitive marketplace of trusted ICT vendors. As a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and a former Marine officer, I take national security very seriously, and our adversaries are very focused on undermining this country. For more than 85 years, TIA, with our 400-member companies, has developed technical and process improvement standards and advanced new technologies that drive our economy. Our current standards cover a wide range of areas, including technical and infrastructure standards, telecom quality management, and our most recent focus on supply chain security. We're technology agnostic, meaning that we support wireline, wireless, and satellite technologies. In short, TIA has almost a century of experience ensuring that communications networks are built efficiently and resiliently with trusted suppliers. The complexity of our networks, as well as the reach of our networks, has grown dramatically in the past decade, and we should anticipate the number of connected IoT devices, for example, will reach over 30 billion in the next 5 years. Attacks come from many directions, including state-sponsored enemies, criminals, and terrorists. While the attack possibilities are endless, we must have a defense in depth, which starts with supply chain security. Ensuring that the products and services that make our networks secure are coming from trusted suppliers who can demonstrate that security is designed into their products, built in, not bolted on. And we should remember that security is a subset of quality. You can't have a high-quality product if it's not secure. The U.S. government recognizes that supply chain security vulnerabilities are forecasted to be a top network attack vector. Just last week, CISA released a joint cybersecurity advisory with other U.S. agencies, including the NSA and the FBI, and other trusted partners, other governments, focused on common vulnerabilities exploiting the supply chain. These vulnerabilities are being exploited at an increased rate, and the report found that many of these risks would have been mitigated by implanting a secure-by-design approach. The industry recognizes this, and that's the reason that we at TIA initiated and developed a new standard, SCS 9001, which is the ICT industry's first supply chain security standard in 2022. This standard was designed with input from both the U.S. and trusted allied governments and aligns with and operationalizes the NIST cybersecurity framework, the Prague principles, and many other guidelines. SES 9001 is a supply chain security management system intended to define and measure the requirements, controls for design, development, production, operations, and service of ICT products. By aligning with a standard, suppliers can demonstrate and verify that their products and services can be trusted. As network architectures continue to advance and become more complex, the potential attack surface grows and expands as well. This gives bad actors, including those who are state-sponsored from foreign adversaries, more targets. The need for security is further illustrated by the unique role communications networks play in our infrastructure. Every one of CISA's 16 identified critical infrastructure networks is fundamentally an ICT network. I believe that these many past high-profile attacks clearly indicate the need to address vulnerabilities within our supply chain and mitigate them wherever possible. A public-private partnership that builds in the elements needed to verify trust, and continually improve can change behavior, reduce the effect that bad actors have on our critical networks. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Meyers.
Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Hawley, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Adam Meyers, Senior Vice President for Counter-Adversary Operations at CrowdStrike. For over a decade, I've led the company's practice area in monitoring and disrupting cyber threats. An overwhelming share of my time over this period has focused on the People's Republic of China. As a leading U.S. cybersecurity company, CrowdStrike has a useful vantage point on China's malicious activities in cyberspace. Protecting organizations with our cybersecurity technology, threat intelligence, and incident response services, we confront a full range of cyber threats. We started CrowdStrike in large part due to a growing impact of unchecked Chinese cyber aggression and the inability of existing security tools to meet that challenge. In 2011, it wasn't uncommon to see Chinese campaigns spanning scores of victims with multi-year duration using extremely basic tactics, techniques, and procedures. Back then, it was considered impolite to call out this activity directly. I'm grateful for the work this committee is doing now to stay focused on this critical problem. At CrowdStrike, we utilize a cryptonym system where we designate Chinese-based threat actors as different pandas. We currently track 63 distinct panda actors, as well as a large number of other activity clusters with likely ties to China. Over 2 decades, I've confronted this problem. I've witnessed an evolution from simple but effective smash and grab type campaigns to a much more sophisticated activity like which we are going to discuss today. These changes spanned operational advancements, enhanced technical capabilities, and considerably greater alignment to formal national political aims. These changes also belie an increase in funding, training, and resources. Today, Chinese threat actors operate complex, sophisticated, obfuscated, and highly effective cyber operation campaigns targeting every region and every industry vertical. Recent campaigns demonstrate the ability to compromise well-resourced and well-defended enterprises that operate as providers for the rest of the technology ecosystem. These examples highlight a growing emphasis on upstream or bulk collection, which is notable for its scale and potential impact. Over the last 18 months, Chinese Nexus adversaries have expanded their operational scale and volume. These intrusions are likely intended to collect strategic intelligence, compromise intellectual property, and advance targeted group surveillance. In addition, CrowdStrike Intelligence and public reporting have observed the adversary called Vanguard Panda, targeting U.S. critical infrastructure, potentially to pre-position disruptive or destructive capabilities in advance of a future conflict. Another threat actor we've observed, Liminal Panda, has focused on exploitation of telecommunications infrastructure around the globe. Notably, they've facilitated command and control and data exfiltration by exploiting legacy telecommunication protocols that are largely unmanaged and unknown to many cybersecurity professionals. I describe additional actors and campaigns in my written testimony and can expand further during Q&A. I'd like to turn to a few policy recommendations I think are worth our collective consideration. The security community must continue to monitor Chinese threat actors and actively hunt for them. The more we understand about these groups, their targeting practices, their resources, and their constraints, the more accurate a threat model we can develop to improve our defenses. Enterprises must protect identities and maintain visibility across increasingly distributed networks. Today, that requires instrumenting and monitoring traditional endpoints like laptops and desktops, network infrastructure, cloud environments, mobile and IoT devices, and increasingly software as a service applications. Federal departments should lead by example and leverage the best tools, training, and concepts of operations for defense available. This will support best practices for the community. Several key departments can also do more to proactively meet and defeat cyber threats. A particular focus should be threat actor infrastructure disruptions, which we could work to increase by 5 to 10-fold. For Congress's part, particularly in support of small businesses, it's appropriate to engage in a more meaningful conversation on the use of tax credits, rebates, or other incentives that we've undertaken to date. We ought to make the best-in-class cybersecurity tools and training more accessible. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Meyers. I'm going to yield to Senator Hawley for his first round of questions because he has another commitment. He may have to leave for it before we finish the hearing. I am going to vote. We have a vote that's ongoing right now, and I will hopefully be back by the time he finishes his questions. If not, if Senator Grassley has questions, Senator Hawley can yield to Senator Grassley, and I'll certainly be back by the time he finishes. Thank you. Thanks, Senator Hawley.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again to all of you for being here. Mr. Meyers, if I could just start with you. You just referred to the Salt Typhoon attack as a sophisticated attack. Can you just elaborate? We still don't know a whole lot exactly of what's happened, at least from public reporting. You have extensive experience in this area, as you've just elaborated, for going back years now. So could you give us your sense of the sophistication level involved here, what we might be looking at in terms of ramifications?
Sure, thank you, Senator. The sophistication isn't necessarily just to be measured in terms of how they get in, but what they do once they get in terms of the broad collection operations that China's been running in general. This really belies what their intention is, to collect large amounts of information that they can later exploit, whether that be political information, military information, or intellectual property. We've seen the Chinese over the past decade significantly up-level what they were doing. In the testimony, I refer to smash and grab operations where they would break into one target, steal the thing that they want, and then leave. They are now maintaining persistent and enduring access to those targets in order to continuously collect large amounts of information and exploit downstream relationships to other interesting targets.
Exploit downstream relationships. Give me an example.
Sure. So with a lot of the telcos or ISPs that might be targeted, they have customer trust relationships, right? In other words, other organizations rely on those critical infrastructures for services or even shared services or web hosting, things of that nature. And they can exploit that trust relationship to then take on the persona of the initially targeted organization to exploit that trust relationship and use that to move to other areas.
So could the hackers impersonate particular individuals?
They could, yes.
Could they disrupt specific communications between particular people?
I'd say it's fair to say once they gain access to the telco or to the mobile provider, they could initiate or disrupt communications, and it's at the core of the system, right? So they'd be able to basically do anything that the telco could do.
You mentioned their intention being to exploit this information. What are some possible examples of that exploitation? What could we be looking at?
In the case of many of these Chinese adversaries, espionage would be the number one objective or motive in order to collect information. But as I mentioned with Vanguard Panda, and this has been covered pretty extensively elsewhere, there is a concern about pre-positioning. So if there was to be, for example, an escalation around Taiwan, could they use that access to disrupt logistics or disrupt military operations or critical infrastructure in the region that would potentially slow or disrupt the U.S. response?
Got it. Does just on that point, does the use of a foreign network hardware in this country, like for instance Huawei, does that make these vulnerabilities worse? Is that something we should be particularly concerned about? What's the effect of that? How does that play into this?
Well, I think with a lot of that foreign technology, there's really no way to assess what's in there. In other words, there is a hardware supply chain concern there. They could have other microchips or other software running inside those devices, so this should be a huge concern.
Is that true of American companies whose hardware is manufactured in China?
Potentially, that could be part of the supply chain concern if it comes back with something different than what was spec'd. Yes.
Mr. Bresnick, let me just ask you on that point, and I've seen your report here, Which Ties Will Bind, which is extremely alarming in many respects, and I want to make sure I get some of these figures right. You say, based on your research, 80% of Apple's suppliers are based in China.
So that's almost exactly right. 80% of Apple's suppliers have at least one facility in China. That's not to say that all of them, that 80% are in China.
I got it. 95% of Apple's key consumer products are manufactured in China.
That's according to Financial Times story. That number is coming down right now, but when the report was written, those were the figures.
32% of Amazon's suppliers are based in China. These are huge numbers. I guess my question is, and you said in your testimony a moment ago, you don't advocate total or full decoupling. I'm just wondering, with numbers like these, are these companies able to decouple at all? I mean, this is an incredible dependency that you outline in your report.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think right now, part of my answer against decoupling is based on the fact that there is no way to completely decouple right now. If you sever manufacturing ties to China, the electronics industry ceases to function, essentially. So I advocate for a de-risking approach where these companies have to set up alternative supply chains in other countries, whether that's in Southeast Asia, South Asia, closer to the United States. It's going to take some time to build up these alternative supply chains.
What would happen if China invaded Taiwan successfully?
Can you clarify that?
Well, I'm just thinking about these supply chains and these companies' dependence on China, and then also the significance of Taiwan to the global supply chain in so many of these areas. I mean, what would the effect be on these companies and, well, let's say our national security broadly if China successfully invaded Taiwan?
Yeah, so obviously that is a very difficult question to answer. I would point you to a report by some researchers at the Baker Institute that I can share with you that tries to outline what an invasion of Taiwan might mean for corporations, national security, et cetera. I think it's very difficult to tell because we don't know how the Chinese government would react to an invasion and however we responded. They could react in a way to sever supply chains, they could interfere with supply chains, they could arrest corporate employees. There's a wide range of eventualities that I don't think anyone has really thought through fully.
I want to come back to this, but Senator Grassley, let me turn to you.
Thank you. I missed the first two people testifying. I apologize. I'm going to start out with Mr. Stehlin. This Congress, I've engaged in extensive oversight relating to cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure and security of Americans' people's data. I've written to federal agencies and the private sector about cyber attacks and the steps taken to protect them. So to you, much of the equipment used in the administration of U.S. critical infrastructure, particularly telecommunication, is or was manufactured in China. What are the national security implications of Chinese technology and equipment in our networks?
Thanks for the question, Senator. The implications are significant from a variety of perspectives. Probably the lowest hanging fruit is we still have a lot of Chinese Huawei and ZTE equipment in small service providers in rural America. There was a rip and replace bill that was put in place in 2020, partially funded, funded to the tune of about 40%, $1.9 billion. But there's another $3.3 billion needed to pull out that Huawei gear from these service providers, typically small, more than 6,000 sites across America. And oh, by the way, many of them are very close to military installations. Senator Daines has put forth a bill to address that in this Congress. So that's about the lowest hanging fruit we have. But without knowing what's in the products, whether they be products that have an American name on them or a trusted country's name on them or a Chinese company's name on them, we don't really know what's in there. And that's why we started Supply Chain Security SCS 9001. It requires a full bill of materials. It requires understanding from a zero trust perspective where all the software comes from. Synopsys earlier this year did a study of looking at 1,000 code bases of various enterprise equipment and found that 96% used open source software and more than 70% had critical vulnerabilities. So this is pervasive. It's a massive issue.
Okay, Mr. Fish, the Office of National Cyber Director has identified memory safety typically represents 70% of the cyber risk facing legacy and modern IT systems. For the manufacturers of these IT systems, what would you recommend they do now to prevent memory safety exploitation?
Thank you. Chinese laws require a huge amount of data sharing for companies that have large presences in China and even small presences. And every Chinese entity that has at least 3 party members must have a party cell. So it must have official party representation inside the businesses. So for companies in the memory safety industry, and frankly for companies in a wide range of sensitive industries, they need to understand that if any part of their supply chain touches China, there are very concrete risks with that, and they need to have a strategy for mitigating those risks.
Okay. And Mr. Meyers, last December, the DNI issued a public bulletin about the risk of foreign commercial spyware. In June, I introduced a bill that we entitled App ID Act with Senator Cortez Masto, which would require apps owned and controlled by foreign adversary companies to disclose that fact to users. Could you explain the threat posed by foreign commercial spyware to everyday American data privacy and steps that we can take to mitigate the threat?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think foreign commercial spyware is, there's a couple of ways to kind of consider what that is made up of, right? There's spyware, which is meant to be spyware, right? Offensive in nature. That is one set of concerns. The other side of that is data collecting code. As an example, on a mobile application, it might use a library that is collecting information about the user and then feeding that back for advertising purposes. And that information can also be used to garner information about the user, where they are, what they're doing, what they're looking at, what they're even saying. And so, along those 2 lines, I think that they need to be considered differently. Foreign commercial spyware, I think, would be more along the lines of a offensive tool that would be regulated similar perhaps to like a weapon system. The more concerning would be the software that is collecting information unbeknownst to the user and how that information is being used. Users don't even know that that library is loaded in the application that they're using.
Okay. My time's up, and I'll have one more question for you, Mr. Meyers, for answer in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Stonefish, let me come to you and pick up the line of questioning that I was starting to discuss with Mr. Bresnick. Here we've got these companies, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Tesla, hugely, hugely invested in China and hugely dependent on China. And it would be one thing if they were, run-of-the-mill, no-name companies, but Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, these are arguably each of those 3 are monopoly-size companies that have significant control of vast sections of our consumer economy. So I guess my question is, how concerned should we be that 80% of Apple suppliers have a base in China, 95% of Apple's key consumer products are manufactured in China, 1/3 of Amazon's suppliers are in China, 10% of Microsoft's China-based research lab produces, or I should say Microsoft's China-based research lab produces 10% of the company's research output. Those are massive numbers. Should we be concerned about this, or is this not relevant? I mean, are we panicking unnecessarily?
Thank you for bringing these issues up. I think this is incredibly important. And I think there's this perception in DC that, oh, everyone's talking about China, we're talking about it too much. I don't think we're talking about this nearly enough. I am really appreciative that you brought up the potential for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and a war with Taiwan. It's our very strong belief that the businesses you mentioned have constantly underpriced the risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and they've long underpriced the risk of their very heavy China exposure. There's massive national security implications of the figures that you just described. And I think US government agencies need to be really aware of the various different interests and influences inside these corporations. You know, we're in an era of shareholder capitalism, and if it's in Apple's best financial interest to double down on China, where does that leave us, and where does it leave Apple consumers who's using an Apple laptop right here, but also the US government? And I think this is especially the case with Microsoft and the US government's relationship with Microsoft, and understanding that the depth of Microsoft's entanglement with China and with the Chinese Communist Party poses very real supply chain and security risks, and these are things that big US companies absolutely need to disclose.
You say that you think that these companies, there's a real risk that they underrate the significance of a potential Chinese invasion and takeover of Taiwan. Just elaborate on that, and what do you think what are some of the scenarios there that we should be prepared for?
So 3 different potential scenarios. One is business as usual, tensions abate. Second is a limited Chinese invasion of Taiwan, perhaps a la what Russia did in Ukraine in 2014, seize a few of the outlying islands, assassinate Taiwanese politicians, seize a little bit of territory and stop, or a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which could potentially lead to World War III. In the latter 2 scenarios, this would have massive upheavals for not only the global order, but US businesses and their interests in China, especially in the 3rd scenario, where the Taiwanese semiconductor market gets knocked offline potentially. Could drastically transform these companies and their share prices. And if this does happen, we expect a lot of companies will expect the US government to bail them out or to support them, when at this time, they're way too exposed to China for US national interests.
While the chairman gets ready to ask his questions, let me just ask you on the scenario where the Taiwanese semiconductor production market gets completely knocked offline, which is a very real possibility for the scenario of a successful invasion of Taiwan. What would that look like for the United States? Just walk us through the potential ramifications there.
Initially, it would be devastating. What usually happens in instances like this, with the caveat that these things are very unpredictable, is that devastating weeks, months, and then people come up with alternatives. It's unclear what that will be, but US ingenuity and brilliance would allow for alternate supply chains and alternate possibilities. And so it wouldn't be a catastrophic end to the technological age, but it would have very, very major implications. And the companies that today are making the right de-risking choices and are making the right choices of moving out of China will be in much better shape if China does invade Taiwan.
Thanks, Senator Hawley. Thank you all again. You know, one question that may occur to someone with little familiarity with the background and details here is, has Chinese spying and hacking gotten worse, or are we just more aware of it? And if it's gotten worse, what's your assessment as to the reasons? I think I know, but I would be very interested in your views, beginning with Mr. Stonefish. Obviously, there's been a lot of focus on Chinese companies like Huawei, and we're perhaps less aware of how American companies have been put at risk because they are doing work in China, taking advantage of a huge Chinese market and production facilities that the Chinese require them to put there, sometimes so they can steal their technology. But have the Chinese tactics and strategy emphasize more spying, hacking, and so forth, or is it just we're more aware of it?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I'll answer in two ways. My big worry is that because so many US companies and entities are so exposed to China, they don't talk publicly about hacking or Chinese espionage. And we don't get anything close to a full picture because it's so taboo for companies to go public with Chinese incursions into their business. I will say the geopolitical moment we're in puts Chinese citizens and Chinese and Americans in a very, very difficult spot because for so many of them, Beijing expects them to act as agents of the Communist Party's interests and the party state. And many of them don't want to. They don't want to have anything to do with that. But Beijing puts them in this incredibly difficult position. And so I'd encourage us all to spare a moment and empathize with that very, very difficult place that they're put into. And I'd encourage also US companies that employ Chinese staff to really think hard about how to protect them. Because if tensions between the United States and China worsen, you're going to have companies that work on sensitive American issues with hundreds of thousands of staff in China who Beijing sees as enemy combatants and starts to round up. And US companies need to take some responsibility for that.
So I take it your answer would be that the Chinese have become more aggressive and, in a sense, expansionist in their use of spying and hacking.
Yes.
Others have a view on that. Yes, Mr. Meyers.
Thank you, sir. So as far as has Chinese exploitation and espionage gotten worse, I'd say that there's three things I would comment on there. Yes, it absolutely has increased. The first concern is that it's matured. They've moved away from smash and grab operations to bulk collection, longer term operations against upstream providers, whether it be telecoms, ISPs, consulting organizations, professional services. So they've matured how they do it and what they're collecting. The second thing, in 2017, 2018, Chinese national security law has effectively privatized the vulnerability research or crowdsourced it, meaning if you do vulnerability research in China, it doesn't go to the vendor as it would here in the United States in order to ensure that it gets fixed and that there's no exploitation. It goes through the Chinese government. So they effectively get first right of refusal for any weapons that are created by researchers or by research organizations and things like the Tianfu Cup, where they have pwn-to-own competitions to see who can write these vulnerabilities. And it's become more opaque, so we only see what maybe categories have won, but we don't actually see what the vulnerabilities or the exploits are. And then thirdly, we've seen that the Chinese have diversified who's doing these operations. Prior to 2015, this was largely the People's Liberation Army. Following the reorg of the People's Liberation Army in 2015, 2016, we started seeing the Ministry of State Security taking a greater role, and now a whole bunch of contract elements, which we've seen in the news and U.S. indictments. U.S. Department of Justice has identified many of them. They are expanding it. So they've effectively created a offensive cyber operations industrial base within China, which is building weapons and capabilities and tools at an incredible pace.
Mr. Stehlin.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I would add to that it's definitely getting more difficult, especially as these networks are growing. So 20 years ago, we basically had wireline networks. Now we have hundreds of millions of people with maybe 1 million cell towers using wireless networks. And then thirdly, we're in the IoT phase where everything is connected in our homes, whether it's your doorbell or a video camera or your refrigerator. Each of these devices is an avenue of access. And typically, we as consumers buy the least expensive thing that's out there, which is the least secure thing that's out there. So it is getting to be a bigger problem than before.
To what extent, apropos of that comment, are, for example, Chinese manufactured drones creating a vulnerability in our country?
A large extent, and I'll give you an example. Often wireless companies will use drones to access the equipment that's up on a tower. It might be 1,000 feet up to analyze the latest, to see what's up there. Is it the latest generation, et cetera? Chinese drones, often with these service providers that are in rural America, are accessing some of these towers, and that information is getting fed back to China, for sure.
Let me ask you, on the supply chain issue, obviously our dependence on China for supply chain creates vulnerabilities. And Mr. Stone Smith, I think you created a graphic, very powerful set of graphs that show that dependence, ranking companies, in fact, according to their dependence and vulnerability. Have you seen any effort? I mean, they know that they're dependent. Any effort to pull back, to create some independence, to address this issue?
Thank you. We have seen some movement by select companies to better understand and reduce their China exposure. For a variety of reasons, they're very, very private about it. We encourage transparency there, but a lot of them don't like to talk about it publicly because they're afraid of reprisals from Beijing. But people understand, both because of the potential for President-elect Trump's tariffs, also because of the potential for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and also because there's a lot of very real frustration in the United States and in the halls of Congress about U.S. overexposure to China, that many businesses, or some businesses, I would say, are moving to reduce this exposure.
Mr. Bresnick.
I would agree with that. I would also, caution that China has huge advantages in at least electronic supply chains, right? It's a massive country that has millions of engineers, right, who are specialized in these very niche electronics manufacturing industries. It has very good power supplies. It has access to water. It has all of these resources that would allow it to be the world's major player in electronics. And again, these companies, right, are trying to shift supply chains. It's a little bit slow going because you can't just plop down a factory in India or Malaysia or Vietnam. You can do that, but the intermediate parts are still coming from China, right? So you move the supplier, the first level supplier, you're still depending on China. So it's not really a matter of picking these suppliers up and putting them in other places. You have to create ecosystems, manufacturing ecosystems that go with those to fully actually reduce the China exposure.
Do you think it's more the practical difficulty of relocating the supply provider, or is it, as Mr. Stonefish suggested, the fear of reprisals? Do you understand the question? In other words, is it the logistical difficulty of moving a supplier or a source of supply out of China, or is it the fear that there will be some kind of revenge from the Chinese government?
I think you could credibly argue it's both. I think it's very hard to logistically do this, and you see companies like Apple, for example, which has made an effort to make more of its iPhones in India generally through Foxconn, a Taiwanese electronics manufacturing company. At the same time they're doing that, Tim Cook is going to China and he's announcing new investments in China. So I think these things go hand in hand. There's a desire to stay in the good graces of the Chinese Communist Party, and there's a desire to actually make moves to reduce exposure.
And would you say Apple has been effective in trying to reduce its exposure?
I only know from news reports, but they're claiming they're making more and more iPhones in India this year. So it appears that they are on the path to reducing their exposure. But I can't tell you how that will go going forward.
If you, as witnesses, I'll ask this question of all of you, were to cite a company that has been effective in trying to relocate its supply chain, could you name one for the committee? I'm not asking you to condemn. I'm asking you to praise. I hope you'll be more, I would understand your reluctance to condemn, but are there any good guys here? Maybe Mr. Fish.
We would love, and I hate to answer in an evasive way, but we would love for the environment to be that the companies that we work with and some companies are proud of reducing their exposure to China, but they're petrified. They're very afraid of reprisal from the Communist Party. They're afraid of losing business in China. They're afraid about their Chinese staff. And so it's a massive structural issue. And as companies start to reduce their exposure, and we often try to remind people the non-Chinese market is much larger than the Chinese market, because people just say, oh, it's China or nothing, but it's a big world out there, and we have a massive, massive market here. So our hope is that companies will be confident enough to say, hey, we've made these really good decisions and really good changes, but it's not quite there yet.
I'm going to interrupt my question. I have more to yield to Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you all for being here and talking with us on this today. It's so interesting to me how the American people have become so aware of the Chinese Communist Party and their tendency to spy on Americans, and they try to find any little entry point in the technologies that we use on a daily basis. And part of the problem with this is so much of our citizens' transactional life is actually conducted virtually. And people are now dependent on that, and they appreciate the efficiencies of that. And one of the things that we have looked at is and Senator Blumenthal and I have worked on these issues from several different angles, but looking at how they use drones, how they use apps, how they use cranes, you name it. They are always looking for a more efficient way to spy on us. Now, one of the things we realized they had started to use is routers and the embedding of malware into these routers. And of course, the U.S. had hackers used routers to target some of our critical infrastructure and water systems. And Director Ray brought this up in one of our hearings, that what they were doing was pre-positioning themselves to carry out a larger attack. So we know this is here. So Senator Lujan and I introduced the Routers Act, which would give us an ability to guard against these cyber threats. And it's a pretty simple bill because it requires Commerce to review the national security threat that comes from some of these routers and technologies that are developed, manufactured, or supplied coming out of China. And also we added to that Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. So they're doing a study on this so that Congress can then take further action after we have better insight into this. But Mr. Meyers, I want to come to you first. I want you to speak for a minute on the importance of understanding this landscape and the appreciation of the threat that is actually in front of us, and why a study like the Routers Act is so important.
Thank you, Senator. The routers, like much of the other technology, part of the underlying infrastructure, represent, in many cases, an unmanaged or unmonitored system. In other words, with endpoint technology, laptops, desktops, servers, network infrastructure is often not instrumented to collect information, telemetry, for security analysts and threat hunters to be able to evaluate what's happening on that system. Routers are also frequently internet accessible, meaning a threat actor can touch that from anywhere in the world. It's not protected behind firewalls or things, security appliances. And the routers are often very constrained in terms of space, so they don't have a lot of room for security tools and for security capabilities to be built onto them. And they're meant for speed. Right? They're meant to route packets from point A to point B as quickly as possible. So routers have become increasingly targeted by nation-state threat actors, especially groups from China like Vanguard Panda and Salt Typhoon, because they are unmanaged. There's no security layer around that, and it gives them the ability to intercept and redirect traffic very effectively.
Thank you. Mr. Stehlin, I want to come to you. Did I say your name right, Stehlin?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Wanted to be sure of that. Senator Warner and I have introduced legislation that would promote U.S. standards and promote our leadership in standard setting, which when we look at China and the threat there, we feel that retaining that leadership is vitally important. I'd like to get you to weigh in on that and see where you are on that standard setting ability.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate that. And the bill that you're talking about, the Promoting U.S. Leadership in Standards Act with yourself and Senator Warner is very important. Honestly, I think the U.S. has lost a lot of its standard leadership, and it's for a variety of reasons. We as a globe have become more regionalized. China is setting up its own set of standards. Europe is setting its own set. India is even heading down that path, and then the U.S. separately. There have been some questions over the past 5 to 10 years about should we be at the table with companies like Huawei when it comes to setting standards. And if we're not, they're going to overwhelm us. It's a typical Chinese methodology of how they win. They win in mass. And if we're not at the table, they will drive these international standards. We need to have international standards, and there has to be U.S. leadership there, as there had been for decades. But that takes time, it takes money. And in a very competitive environment, a lot of companies have scaled back their leadership team, their team related to standards, because they're trying to increase their gross margin. So it's really critical that the U.S. build back our leadership in standards and be at the table globally and help drive global standards.
Thank you. I've got one more question. May I go ahead with this? Mr. Bresnick, your report you did this summer on the PRC perspectives on the challenges, I'd like to ask you about quantum. This is something that at Commerce Committee we've looked at a good bit, and we're trying to get the quantum initiative reauthorized for the U.S., and some of us have a quantum sandbox bill. But I'd love for you to just talk for a second about how concerned you are about the CCP's investments into quantum and the risk that presents.
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I'm not really positioned to answer that question very well because that paper doesn't dive into quantum very much. I'm happy to, write to you to, do some research and write to you.
Okay, submit that one for the writing,
Okay.
for the record. I would love to hear from you on that and get your perspective. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Blackburn. I have a few more questions. We talked a little bit about Apple's dependence on the Chinese supply chain. Let's talk a little bit about Tesla. Half of its production, a third of its sales, roughly, are dependent on China. Does that concern you, Mr. Stonefish, Mr. Bresnick, and why?
It absolutely does concern me, and it's a very, very difficult position for Mr. Musk to be in that Beijing loves to use corporate leverage over U.S. companies and U.S. individuals to advance its national security interests. And frankly, I don't know how Mr. Musk can balance the interests he has with the U.S. government, with Tesla, and with SpaceX at the same time. It's very, very challenging. This spring, Mr. Musk was in Beijing meeting with the Chinese premier, Li Qiang. He wrote an article, he was the first foreigner to do so, writing an article for a big Chinese propaganda outlet a couple years ago. And it's amazing he's managed this balancing act for so long, and I'm very curious to see how he keeps it up.
And when you say the Chinese will use their economic leverage, they will threaten to seize his operations, they will threaten to stop his sales. Is that the kind of leverage you're talking about?
There's a Taiwanese businessman, Terry Goh, who is the chairman of the company that runs Foxconn. It's a very major Apple supplier. And he ran for Taiwanese presidency. And as part of his campaign, he talked a big game on China. And he said, if China wants to do anything to my businesses in China, go ahead. And so they did. And they started investigating, I think it was tax irregularities in his business. And Terry Goh went quiet. And so oftentimes they will say, hey, you're not following this tax rule. Lotte, the South Korean corporation, they had a land deal in South Korea with the US for a US weapons system, and suddenly their business in China had all sorts of problems. And Beijing rarely ties it together directly because they like to keep people guessing. But it's very believable that Tesla will face a series of unrelated business challenges in China and will just wait for someone at a senior level, perhaps Mr. Musk or other people, to work to placate Beijing so that those business challenges go away.
Do others have comments or observations? Well, I'm deeply troubled because the Department of Defense and other agencies are becoming more reliant on SpaceX, and Mr. Musk has been promised influence over federal budgets and regulations. And the Wall Street Journal, meanwhile, has reported that Mr. Musk has been in regular contact with Vladimir Putin, and that the Chinese government views him as a potential back channel to the White House. So it isn't only the vulnerability in China, it's also our reliance, our Defense Department's reliance on SpaceX, and the potential for that dependence to create a vulnerability for our government. I think it is beyond dangerous. I think it is a profound threat to our national security that Mr. Musk and SpaceX are in this position. And it's not necessarily of Mr. Musk's doing, fairness to him. The Chinese government is an authoritarian and autocratic engine of repression, and they will use whatever levers they have to advance their interests. In this country, we wouldn't think of throwing the CEO of General Motors in jail simply because we didn't like her public statements. But in China, that happens. And they would never think of relying on a company that in turn had a dependence on the United States. They would seize that company. Now, I am not suggesting the United States of America seize SpaceX, but we are in a profoundly anomalous position vis-a-vis China, where we have kind of turned the other cheek. And we've left that cheek turned, and China isn't stopping at the cheek, it's seizing the whole head. So I think that you are absolutely right what you said at the very beginning, Mr. Stonefish, that all of these technology firms have now reached a crossroads. They've been trying to be on both tracks at the same time. They've tried to straddle the fence, and they've reached an endpoint for that dual strategy where risk can be managed. It can no longer be managed, which is why I asked the question about whether the Chinese threat level has increased, and clearly it has. They've become more aggressive, and there's no sign of that increasing risk in any way moderating or mitigating in the near future. So I think the conflicts of interest that have been raised here are not necessarily out of malevolence on the part of any tech CEO. It's the position that the Communist Chinese Party has put them in. And these are public companies, so they have an obligation to shareholders to maximize profit. That's what they're doing by being there. But somehow they have lost a moral compass here, or a national security compass. And Mr. Bresnick, you have said you can't simply plop down, I think that was the term you used, a new factory somewhere. But a company can do a lot if it's willing to incur the cost. At the end of the day, it's all about cost and expense. You can move operations. It may be costly to make those investments, but it is possible to do it, and companies have done it and decided to break that dependence. We've been talking a little bit about TikTok and ByteDance. TikTok spent years promising that it could hold its Chinese parent company, ByteDance, apart from its U.S. operation. No connection, complete separation. And despite those promises, TikTok was found storing data in China and spying on users, which has led to the action taken by the Congress. Let me ask all of you, based on your experience, do you trust that ByteDance and TikTok could ignore demands from the Chinese government like TikTok claimed that it could? Mr. Stehlin?
Thank you, Senator. I don't think they can ignore it. They're, like most large Chinese companies, are very dependent and connected to the CCP. So I'm not sure how they would ever ignore that, and I'm not sure how they would ever separate their algorithm to make it a company that's not dependent on the basis of how it was found. And you know what they do with that information, it allows them to create a Trojan horse, as we've talked about in other discussion here, for possible future use.
Other comments? Mr. Stonefish?
If Apple and Microsoft can't ignore the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party, TikTok doesn't have a prayer to do so. And I think that the broad framing and what a lot of folks outside of the national security world don't understand is the threat that TikTok poses in the United States in the very scary but very real possibility of a war between the US and China. So TikTok in a time of peace is a manageable threat. TikTok in a time of war is absolutely devastating.
I think that's very well put. The only amendment I would offer is I think it's a serious threat in time of peace as well as war, and actually could lead to war by giving the Chinese greater capability and perhaps complacency about our determination. Let me ask you, Mr. Meyers, can you tell us a little bit more about what CrowdStrike has seen from Chinese hackers targeting phone and IT companies?
Thank you, Senator. They continue to operate in every vertical that we monitor, every geographic region. They are constantly collecting information that will enable them to have diplomatic success, potentially military utility. They target intellectual property of American and Western businesses, which they attempt to steal and replicate within their own markets. And they have been using these same capabilities to target dissidents, to target individuals who have spoken out or taken a negative position on the CCP or the PRC in general. And we see this not abating. And I'd like to maybe just introduce something that I thought of as we were talking about some of the other topics, that in order to have a good defense, you need to have a good offense. And there is, sitting and watching them conduct these operations, collection, there's things that we can do to stop that. There's things that we can do to disrupt their operations and activities. And I think that this is something that we need to partner with public sector and private sector in order to have much more effective disruptions to impose cost on those threat actors and demonstrate that this is not something that can occur without any sort of repercussions.
The Wall Street Journal reported that in some cases, Chinese hackers have obtained access to the wiretapping capabilities built into phone and broadband networks. The FBI and Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency have acknowledged that those hackers obtained call records and communications of U.S. government targets. Could you break down for us in sort of common sense layman's terms what that means? There are capabilities in the networks that enable the United States lawfully, with a court warrant and approval, to do wiretapping, and somehow the Chinese have hacked into those capabilities, and they now can do what the United States government could do only with court approval, as well as the United States could do in wiretapping our citizens. Is that roughly what's happening?
That's my understanding, sir. Yes, the lawful intercept tools that are present for lawful purposes, if there's a warrant or other means for law enforcement to collect information, is a goldmine for a foreign threat actor. This provides full content and the ability to not just see who somebody is calling and when they're calling, but more information about what the content of that call is, the content of SMS traffic, and what mobile device, what tower it's talking to. So it can also provide them what is the physical location, and not just that, but who are they with? What other devices might be present with that individual? So as they move from tower to tower, they could see, are they in a car with other individuals with other devices that can then be additional targets that they might want to collect on?
They can harvest and collect huge amounts of data with that capability, correct?
Yes, it's a gold mine.
A gold mine that is permitted, I'm being somewhat simplistic here, by the United States government. My reaction, and I think the reaction of a lot of people, is shame on us for somehow permitting it. Aren't there actions we can take to stop them? And when I say we, I mean the United States government or the IT systems, or, you know, the layman would say, someone stop it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that this is, to my earlier point, that we should be looking at how to disrupt these operations. We can no longer sit by and watch them happen. We need to work to identify infrastructure that is being used to conduct these intrusions. We need to look at what tools are being used. And disruption can take many different forms. It can be publicly acknowledging and outing it so that it becomes more aware and people can stop it. It can involve working with providers to disrupt the infrastructure, to take down domains and IP addresses that are being used by these threat actors, and more aggressive means as well. But again, I think we need to be looking at how to disrupt this activity, not just watch it happen.
I wonder, Mr. Stehlin, if you could describe, maybe at just a broad level, how enforcement systems work and the risk associated with their breach. In other words, what are the risks of breaches of law enforcement?
Thank you for that, Senator. Yeah, the CALEA Act, the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, put in place in 1994, allows for the use of intercept access points, which are a blend of hardware and software to allow lawful intercept of information through a court order, as we described. In essence, it's the same technology that's used to run any sophisticated network. It's just dedicated for this application. So if we don't fundamentally solve the problem of understanding where the software is coming from, where the hardware is coming from, is it trusted, is the vendor a trusted vendor, we will have these types of issues for things like lawful intercept, as well as common usage of wireline and wireless networks. So it's a fundamental problem of using standards to hold and verify these companies to make sure that they are building trusted components and trusted products.
I want to ask a final question, going back to where I began. The Federal Communications Commission is not without power and agency here. I've suggested that it ought to start rulemaking. It ought to take some action, even under existing authority. We love to introduce new legislation in Congress, but often we know it is going to be futile. And so I have tried to emphasize the importance of agencies using their existing authority. Do you agree with me that the FCC ought to begin rulemaking and that it ought to take some action to help protect our country and the American public? And I'll just go down the table. Mr. Stonefish.
Yes, and very quickly on existing legislation, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act restricts the export of goods made in Xinjiang and forces the companies to themselves prove whether or not they were made with forced labor. It's an excellent piece of legislation, and I look forward to seeing more implementation of it.
Thank you. Mr. Bresnick.
It's a little outside my area of research, but I will say some of my colleagues at CSET, including one sitting behind me, has written about that issue, and we can forward you, how to use research on how to use existing authorities for the purposes you mentioned.
Wonderful. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Mr. Stehlin.
Yes, sir. Two things. First of all, I mentioned rip and replace before. If Congress can fully fund that $3.3 billion, which comes to the FCC to help them pull out untrusted gear from small wireless networks. That's number one. Number two, the FCC has a new program, a cybersecurity labeling program for home IoT devices. Currently, it's voluntary. It's in its formative stage, but this is something that will help us stop access of devices in the home, whether it's a home router or a Ring doorbell, for example, and ensure that those devices are trusted. So they would put a label on the device to show that it is in fact trusted. So those are a couple of examples.
Thank you. Mr. Meyers.
Thank you, sir. I'd say that we at CrowdStrike are happy to work with any agency, law enforcement, and intelligence community or federal agency that has a mandate to do anything to disrupt or to negatively impact these adversaries collecting intelligence, and we'll continue to work with our partners.
Thank you. I would welcome any suggestions for remedies, whether they're legislative or administrative, that we can push. This session has been enormously valuable. I apologize that more of my colleagues weren't here, but they will be reading the transcript, and they have staff who were here, and this topic is going to continue in public importance, so we will want to continue to be in touch with you and really greatly value your contribution. And the record's going to be kept open for a week, so my colleagues can ask additional questions for the record if they wish. We will probably have some, but very much welcome any follow-up Mr. Bresnick or any of you may have. This topic is growing, fortunately, in awareness, as my colleague Senator Blackburn mentioned. The American public is becoming more aware, but still not enough. And so we're going to keep telling them about Chinese spying and hacking and trying to do something about it. I apologize. We have another vote that's ongoing. I don't have anyone to take the gavel for me at this point, and you've been very patient. So I'm going to close the hearing, keep the record open for a week. Thank you all.